Okay, hello and welcome again to another episode or webinar series of Tortus AI Academy. I'm Dr. Don Pimenta. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Tortus. I was going to be joined by my good colleague, Dr. David Triska, for this session, but unfortunately he's away for personal reasons. But he helps us write the slides and has contributed a lot to this session. So, just as a reminder, what are we doing here? Tortus AI Academy is all about helping NHS digital leaders and CXOs to better understand the AI landscape. So just to have a little recap, we kicked off in December. This is the fourth of 5 initial series. So we did what is AI, and that covers all the basics and the fundamentals. I'll share a link on our AI wiki if you haven't seen it already, but you can watch all these sessions back, and there's lots of resources on those sessions from December. We looked at evaluation with Sarah Gabau in January. We looked at clinical risk a couple of weeks ago with Ellie Ascari. Today, we're going to do a great topic, and we might go a bit off piste here because we're going to delve into how I look at adoption in clinical AI. And then next fortnight, we'll probably end up doing quite an interesting panel session with a bunch of leaders in the space to sort of think about the future and what healthcare could look like in 2 years, in 5 years, in 10 years. So that one's going to be super fun. Okay. So today, yeah, that's a good point. The goal of this series is not a computer science class. It is not to delve into the deep ethics or how the models work or the maths behind it. The goal is to simply make better buying decisions. When you're looking at clinical AI from a vendor, which is going to become more and more part of the skill set that we all need if we're holding budgets for our hospital systems or organizations. So it's all about wisdom and understanding the different elements and the complexities of how to do that. So it's a crash course in AI for healthcare from concept to clinic. So today we're going to cover adoption in clinical AI. So we're going to talk about practical insights on implementation and how to think about implementation. And we might go a bit off piece there into product management, which I think is actually a slightly more interesting way of talking about this. How to persuade the most skeptical and what to do with sort of trust, credibility, how to roll out, how to monitor, and how to ensure ROI. Okay, so to kick us off then, what are we talking about? Now, this is interesting for me. I was 16 years in the NHS. I've been in tech for a couple of years, and actually how people talk about adoption is quite different. The one thing everybody acknowledges is driving adoption does not simply mean tell the people to use the thing. And you will hear me refer to the thing a lot as the generic technology or product or software or whatever we're trying to implement. There are lots and lots of words for this in the NHS, some of which you may have come across before: change management, transformation, digital delivery, but it all means the same thing. How do we get people using something that they weren't previously using? So a really good way of thinking about this, and maybe a bit different to how we thought about this before, is to think about it how tech thinks about this. So in my mind now, and this is something I've been learning about personally, like crossing the fence from clinical into tech, adoption is product management at its most basic. So what we'll do now is we'll go through some very simple basic definitions of product management and then look at adoption through that lens. So I have a really simple definition of what a product is in the tech space. I'm just going to move my laptop a little bit here. A product is something that transforms an input into an output. And a good product does that for a reason. So chocolate kettle being a terrible product, for example, solves no problems. Good products solve a problem. And we'll come back to that because understanding that you're trying to solve a problem first helps you decide the qualities that you need for the technology and the product in front of you. So here's my favorite example of man's first product, or human being's first product, I should say. So let's have a look at this. So here's a problem. We've got some cold people who are hungry. Somebody invented the product of fire. This is obviously a Neanderthal time product. And it was solved with warm people and cooked food. Easy peasy, right? So what is product management then? So product management is the continuous optimization of that input to the output. So first fire invented, warm people, cooked food people, and then people started moaning or feedback. So, the fire took ages to build, or it's super inconvenient, or the logs were too wet, or it's very inefficient, or, we all fell into it and burned alive. So fire by itself is a product, and product management iteration is about taking feedback from that product and trying to figure out, is there a better way to optimize this input output. Flash forward 10,000 years or whatever, we've decided the best way to optimize the problems that we're trying to solve then is to split them up. People are hungry, people are cold. We rarely try and put those two things together anymore. We've optimized experience products for both of those problems very specifically. So we've invented ovens and we've invented radiators, and now we have cooked food, which is convenient and accessible and controllable, and we are warm and it's all automatic and in the background, and we've got lots of fancy thermostats on top of that. But I think the point is, we both know we're inventing new ovens all the time, air fryers, shout out, and we're inventing new ways to stay warm, heaters and thermostats and automation and AI. So this is a continuous process. And it's really important to think about this mindset when you come to think about adoption of technologies, especially, in fact, AI technologies, simply because it gives you a roadmap to think about, well, what are we actually trying to do? So before anything else, and this is why I was emphasizing this mindset, before technology, before AI, before workflow, we need to ask one simple question. How well do we understand the problem that we are trying to solve? So here's a nice healthcare orientated example, completely hypothetical, but based on some real world data and some real world problems that have occurred. So problem that we're trying to solve with technology: do not attend rates, DNA rates, are higher in lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So we think we're going to build ourselves a product, it's a fancy AI machine, automate sending SMS text messages to patients in those cohorts due to come in the next day. Sounds like a great idea. But then we get some feedback, so completing that loop, no change at all. Nothing happened, didn't make a difference. What happened? Perhaps we didn't understand the problem that we were actually trying to solve. So again, this is based on some real world cases. The DNA rates are higher in lower socioeconomic groups, but not because they are in socioeconomic groups, because there's a correlation in those groups generally with patients who don't speak English as a first language. So the problem that we're trying to solve, we misunderstood, therefore we built the wrong solution. The correct solution was to send letters to the patients in their first language. And obviously we solved this. And then clinics were too busy. They were already overbooked to account for DNAs. So we built ourselves a new problem, which is often actually how these product cycles work. When you change workflow and solve one problem, you create another one. And that's actually a good thing, right? You've solved one problem and you create a new one. You're constantly iterating. But to think about it as a constant process, as opposed to one and done, everything's going to be great, because it rarely is. And there's new processes that you have to manage. And that's just the nature of deploying any technology. So once we know our problem, then we have to know your user. I have to say, I love this. Is actually my favorite webinar so far. So what do they actually do? And I think that's a really hard question to answer. On the top level, for example, what does a postman do? I can speak from a little bit of personal experience. My brother was a postman for about a year, about 25 years ago. What do they do? I mean, we know they deliver letters. But when we ask this question from this perspective of trying to solve a problem for a specific user, a specific clinician, a specific workflow, we need to basically ask the question, what time do they wake up? Do they use an alarm? Where do they keep their clothes? Do they need to keep their uniform? How many uniforms do they have? Do they have to wash them? Do they dry them? Do they iron them before they leave the house? What shoes do they wear? Where do they park their car? Do they go and drive their van? Do you see what I mean? The complexity of the granularity of what you need to actually understand to be able to solve a problem is something that actually I think we're quite bad at. And that's universal as human beings. We think we know what's going on over there, but until we've lived that experience and looked at it, we very rarely actually know enough to solve a problem for somebody over there. And that's the same thing in the hospital system, clinicians, as it is in any other sector of tech. What are they afraid of? And I'll talk specifically around that, because that's a really important part of driving adoption in any technology, but really, really important in AI. It's a new technology. There's a credibility issue around it. People have lots and lots of existential worries. Lots of stuff is happening all the time. It's scary. So understanding that is really important. And what are the pain points and how do we characterize them? What are they trying to solve that's causing them pain that will drive adoption if you fix it? So there's some really nice things from the tech world that really characterize this. And many of you, if you've ever worked in any sort of change, transformation, or implementation team, or any product team for that matter, would have seen this before. So this is what's known as the four forces of change. You have forces that push you from a before state to the new thing. So you have a push, what pushes you away from the old, and what pulls you towards the new. So what is the pain that's pushing you to change your behavior? What is the pull of the new functionality that attracts you towards that change? And we talk about strong pushes being painkillers, and we talk about sort of nice pulls being vitamins, but equally, it's what directs you from before to the new thing. And then we have the forces of change in the opposite direction that keep you staying in the status quo. So anxieties, again, super important when we talk about technology, especially AI. What is the user worried about that prevents using the thing? And habits. And this, I think, is a really key one, especially in clinical workflows where everything we do is extremely ritualized. If you do anything 30 times a day, it will become a habit. You cannot help it. That is how your brains are wired. So if you're seeing 30 patients a day, whatever you repeat in those workflows will become an intensely strong habit. And if we look around, most of the failures of adoption of any technology in the clinical landscape is because we were trying to change a habit that was happening multiple times a day, trying to change ward round discharge processes, trying to change the way the doctors do their consultations, trying to way the nurses do their drug rounds. These things are really hard because they are habitual. And breaking those needs to take account all the pushes and the pulls and all the anxieties to be able to break habits. So this is some really interesting data. So let me pause this. This is a video. And in fact, I don't know if I can zoom in. But so what we've been doing at Tortus is we've been studying clinician workflows. So this is the only data I had to show you this. I don't tend to veer too much into it, but we'll use ambient voice technology implementation as our case study because that's where we personally have a whole bunch of knowledge and data about what we've been doing for the last 2 years. So what this is it's a time graph. Each of one of these dots here represents a single clinical episode, right? So this is one clinician doing a whole clinic. So each of these dots is roughly, I think, about 10 different patients that she saw over the clinic. We're stacking them up and we're playing them back to you in parallel. So you're basically watching each clinic happen at the same time. And what we're measuring here is we had a human observer in the room. In the center is when the clinician was interacting directly with the patient. Around the outside are a whole bunch of other tasks that they could potentially be doing. Reading the computer, when they're outside the room, when they're doing notes on their computer, so typing, when they're not doing anything at all, when they're writing physical notes, when they're ordering things on the computer, and there's some other elements to it. So as you watch this, you'll see that constantly in every patient interaction, the clinician is flicking between multiple tasks. And we call this in the industry context switching, and we use that in multiple different circumstances. Very bad for the brain. We know this from Twitter and Instagram as much as anything else these days. Context switching is something that is really, really important to understand how user workflows are working, especially when you want to break that context. When you want to introduce something different, you have to understand how noisy it is already. So this is the workflow done. Look, she's done some clinician appointments already. So there's a sort of end of finish state. But they keep going back and forth between computer notes, between computer read, between direct care, back and forth. So we mapped that out, and that gave us a lot of insight. And then what we did is we introduced ambient voice technology. So for those who don't know what that is, it's listening to the computer, listening to your conversation. You don't have to really take notes contemporaneously, at the same time as typing is the talking to the clinician, and it's doing stuff in the background. So you can see the difference. Most of that context switching now is eliminated, and now the clinician is basically spending almost the entire time on direct care, occasionally going to the computer, occasionally going to computer read. But what's really interesting from us is we've changed the workflow again, and now the computer is not being used for large parts of the consultation, whereas before it was intermittently being used all the time. So there's a change in workflow and there's a new problem to solve or a new opportunity to solve. Maybe that computer could be doing something else by itself. And you'll also see that consultations now are a little bit shorter. So the workflow has changed and some of the habits have changed. That's a sort of very interesting, pretty video to show you, but really to emphasize, this is the kind of level of detail you really do need to understand before implementing any technology into any, especially clinical workflows. So then let's take a look at AVT continuing the case study. So again, ambient voice technology, speech text AI, plus large language models, listening to consultations, creating notes and letters. Technology most of us are quite familiar with at this stage in our lives. So let's look at the pushes and the pulls and the habits and the anxieties using that use case. And this is from our own learnings. So what is the push? So context switching, you've already seen that. It's very heavy cognitive load. So it takes a lot out of you to constantly switch between keyboard, between mouse, between pop-ups and the patient, who's often telling you things that are very important from a diagnostic point of view or a clinical significance. What is the pull? Product could be very simple to use, could save you a lot of time, could improve patient contact, a few different pulls to technologies, but it's primarily the push, actually, for this technology of how much work you're currently doing that you just don't want to do anymore. But we also have to acknowledge the anxieties. And these are something that we've learned from experience, talking to lots and lots of users for this specific technology, but any AI technology, you won't really know what people's anxieties are until you put it in front of them, until they start using it and you just ask them. So the other principle of implementation, especially for AI, is you really do have to try it. And you have to try it in ways, in real world environments where the stakes are very high, and try to figure out why don't people use it. And that will help you with adoption at scale. So anxiety, is it going to miss something? Big anxiety for this type of technology. Is it going to sound like me? And we have to remember that often when you're making clinical notes, that's what you'll read back in the coroner's court. So I was always taught, write your notes to the judge. Similar thing here, we're looking specifically at technology that can change the documentation style. So it has to represent you. You have to have minimal edits to make sure it does represent you. And is it going to break? So one of the big anxieties here is if you ask the clinician to not type anymore because they don't need to, the opportunity cost is they didn't take any notes if they were normally typing. Some people actually do write handwritten notes as well, especially for long consults, but that's the exception. So if it's going to break, the robustness becomes really important because you suddenly lost and you haven't made that record, and the opportunity cost of using an AI technology versus not is not something that we often factor in, but that's a key anxiety. And lastly, about habits. Keyboard typing is very habitual. Trying to break that is really, really hard. And the others are the other habits that we don't necessarily know that we don't know. So one of the most interesting things that I've observed is when you take the keyboard away, there is no longer an excuse to look away from the patient when you're actually interviewing them. And that sounds like a really weird thing to say, but for any clinicians on the call, they know exactly what I mean. Sometimes you'll use the computer time to think, and you want to look away from the patient while you're talking to them. But if you take that excuse away, that context switching, A, you can't interrupt the patient, which is much better for them, but B, you're suddenly having to look directly at them, which is a normal human interaction. So the humanity gets restored, but yeah, it is quite uncomfortable. And it's uncomfortable because it's such a strong habit to not look at the patient when you're talking to them. Good thing to restore, but just to acknowledge again, that's something habitual that can, for this specific type of technology, reduce the ability to get it adopted. Just going to pause there and see if there's any thoughts or questions. There's some chat. Does Tortus recognize any other? Oh, yeah, we'll come back to some questions. Okay, so I think this is also important to understand that the push will be different in different clinical settings and with different users. So what motivates somebody to change, even with a similar technology, so again, sticking with this case study of ambient voice technology, in primary care, probably quite different from what it is in outpatients. I mean, the technology is very similar, documentation burden similar, but what actually the drivers are different. So what we've observed in primary care, it's very much about quality of life and reduction in cognitive load. In outpatients, there's a much higher per patient administrative burden. If you think about all the letters and notes and sometimes very long, complex documents, which is not accounted for in short consultation time. So there's lots of pajama time. So reducing that, time outside or at home when you're writing up complex notes or MDT decisions or whatever it might be, that's a different use case, different push to understand. A&E, it's all about throughput. It's all about how many patients can you see per hour. And in mental health, there's different use case again, very long consultations. When you actually, a 90-minute consultation, you personally are not going to actually maybe remember without taking notes what you started at, especially if you're doing things like mental state examination, for example, during the consult. You might want to have some non-verbal observations as well. But certainly you could argue that it's a better patient rapport than typing during the consultation. So therefore, rolling out by department, you need to optimize. What is the push and what is the pull? So that's some basics of product management, but a really nice way, I think, to think about it, and certainly, obviously, the way that we think about it as a tech company, but really something that we're trying to push more and more people to think about, especially for AI adoption of any technology, really. Okay, so some basic things that we've learned from implementation. I think this is one you read in lots of textbooks, but this is really, really true. You need a champion. And actually, that champion has to have a certain number of characteristics that are actually pretty repeatable across most of when we've done this, a couple of dozen times now, and actually it's almost always exactly the same person. So they need to understand the push. And what I mean by the understand is like that depth of understanding, like I've lived this problem, I understand why we would want to change it. So ideally, they're a local clinician leader, or at least somebody who is very familiar with the problem. If they're an A&E consultant and they're helping their A&E department adopt the technology, or they're a radiologist and they're helping the radiology department adopt the technology. Tech has always understood this, but I think for any implementation, having these people on the ground and super engaged, and actually having the the ear of the department, I suppose, is really, really important. They also have to be the evangelists for the pull, right? So everyone can understand the pain, but sometimes they'll disagree about where they need to go to get away from the pain. So a leader will be able to evangelize and love whatever that product is. So I use this AI score every day, it saves me so much time, or it's so accurate, or whatever that might be. Often evangelists are converted by science. The one thing I left off this slide is often the conversion is what creates the strongest champions. So if you walk into a room and you're trying to get an organization to adopt some sort of clinical AI thing, the cynic in the room that you can convince with evidence, with the product itself or whatever, often becomes the strongest champion. And actually vice versa, your strongest champion that gets disillusioned will often become your biggest cynic. So you do need to be really careful about how you manage those conversions, but in the right way becomes a massive asset. They've already overcome their own anxieties. And I think that's really important. Again, if you haven't lived it and you haven't used it, there's nothing more powerful than someone saying, I've used this technology. I know you're worried about X. I was worried about X too, but this thing is fine. Or I've overcome it this way, or I just do this one thing. And that's actually a really, really important part of the champion, again, being local and being connected to the team that you're trying to convert. And lastly is understanding the habits, how strong they are, what's important, what isn't important, what kind of little hacks can you get out of those habits. Human beings, from a neuroplasticity point of view, very malleable in general. These type of technologies, and especially some changes, sometimes the workflow change is quite big. Sometimes it isn't. And I think the best products sometimes are incrementally change you to do something else, or do something else in a different way and discover it naturally. Now, this is some other secret knowledge, which I don't think I've ever read in a textbook, but something that we've observed is champions are often visionaries. They're often great leaders. They're often really good evangelists. They aren't the best day-to-day, do the boring stuff well operators. So we term that operators. So if you're thinking about implementation, especially for clinical AI, you need to pair these people up. Find your champions, and then find around them the operators that believe in that champion but can deliver. And they can deliver in the is the training done on time? Did people come to their dates? Did they sign the microphones in and out? And that maintains the momentum, because the champions can get drained. It's very draining to try to change a department, for example, to adopt something, because that takes a lot of positive energy. Whereas the operators can sort of deploy that, make sure it happens, get people through it, get people excited, and continue to be excited about it and maintain that momentum. You do need to put those two people together. It's not obvious at all, but even now, some of you are listening and thinking, "Oh yeah, I know who an operator is or who a champion is." There are people that you've met, and thank God the NHS is full of both of those people, because otherwise nothing would actually get done. Okay, adoption is not a quick, and it takes a lot of effort. It takes time, it takes trust, especially for AI, and it does take a lot of trial and error. So time is really important. Clinicians are time poor. Is this a PC time? You can't half-ass this, right? It's not something that you can throw something in front of somebody. If they have a bad experience, often that is the experience. It's just like your first impression of a person. You meet it for the first time, it doesn't really work. You're probably not coming back, at least for months and months and months. Some hacks here: make sure that people have time and space, especially if you're trying to, originate something with a champion. They need time and space and resource to do that. Scalable, highly engaging training materials. And I say that as somebody who's done, the What is Fire e-learning many, many times in an NHS career. They need to be engaging. They need to be something that, shows the product or shows the workflow or speaks to the habits and the anxieties. Like, really be thoughtful about that, because that's very scalable. So we, for example, now have an e-learning platform that has been actually very useful for us in getting people to understand the technology and have that aha moment, we call it, much quicker. Now, trust. Trust, I would think, in AI especially, is absolutely critical. It cannot be underestimated. Even if you think this is a super good system, very credible vendor, all this evidence, people will naturally just trust it. And it is that age where that's not necessarily the wrong thing to do. They want to understand the evidence. They want to understand how you've assessed it. They want to understand what it might mean for them, for their patients, for their medical legal. And we'll come on to that in a second. So how do you build trust? I think evidence is really important. If it's the right audience, then publish papers is very helpful, and education as well. But I think the biggest thing to make sure you can get people to do is to play with it. You can tell people about something as much as you like, and most people only listen to about 5% of what anyone says anyway. But when they try something, then you'll see either it's something that they'll understand or they won't, and they'll understand it more or less instantly. So again, when you're looking at technologies in the clinical AI space, putting a product management hat on in this sense is so important, because you really think, okay, what's the initial user experience for the actual people on the ground who I think want to use this technology, whether it's the admin staff or the clinic staff or the clinicians themselves. What is their first onboarding experience? How do they access the UI? These things aren't just pretty. They actually define the experience and get them to be able to start using it and to then start making new habits so it gets adopted. Time and time and time again, we spend a lot of money on technology and we miss this one bit, that it doesn't matter how much the hospital spent on it or the organization spent on it. They don't like it and it doesn't fit into their workflow easily. It'll be really hard to get much value out of it because people just won't use it. And that's just the reality. Okay, so for changing, it's a team sport. At least in the best instances that we've seen, it's a team sport. So the most successful implementations, and I'm thinking now of a very specific and very, very good implementation in one of our A&E sites, has been teams taking it on all together. And there's lots of different reasons for that. Builds community knowledge, lowers mutual anxiety. We're all trying something together, so takes down that individual anxiety, that individual risk. Creates a social pull. Everyone's doing that cool thing over there. Let's go do that. And actually, interestingly, we observed that people naturally form tips and tricks, hacks. They start sharing ideas. It becomes a very exciting way to integrate. And then you lose all of that if you try and, lots of people say, oh, anyone in the hospital wants to use, or anyone who wants the org wants to use this individual technology on their own. Actually, that's quite isolating. And what we've observed is when you start like that, it's actually very hard for that one adopter to spread it even to the colleagues adjacent to them, because there's a different mentality. Whereas if they all start and learn together, then there's something that bonds during that. And then some AI technologies do require networks to maximize effect. Struggling to think of one off the top of my head, but there's certainly some in that category. Get ahead of common anxieties. I think some of the things we've heard, again, I'll talk specifically around some of the things that we hear sometimes around AI, are pretty common. And I think rather than trying to wait for the question or skip around the question, just hit it up front. Hit it in some training materials, talk to people about it, acknowledge their fears. We're really bad at this as well. So being replaced, this will put me out of a job. The learning curve and the change fatigue. Oh my God, it's not another IT thing. Oh no, it's a cool AI thing. It doesn't really work. Privacy and security. Where does my data go? People are really worried about that, especially in the world of AI. And then medical legal concerns. What will I say in court? What's my defensibility? How does this change? These are the things that everyday clinicians always worry about. But it's really important that A, we thought about it, and B, that we communicate those solutions to the people who know us. So I thought I'd just finish here before we get into the question and answer time with a bit of a cookbook. This is something that we've internally been working on, some of the thoughts that we've had that may or may not be useful if you're implementing any AI technology. So this one I've slightly adapted from Dave. Start small and waterfall. So obviously you know what a waterfall is, but I think it's really easy to want to try to roll out big things. I'm not talking about like do a little pilot and then see what happens. I mean, when you want to talk about an actual rollout strategy, this is probably one of the strongest ways of doing that. So two ways of doing it. One, if you have an AI technology you could use anywhere in the org, I mean, I'm not talking about specific radiology technologies, but maybe like something a bit more ubiquitous, like ambient voice technology or like a scoring system or something. Find the highest value point, right? Where those forces of change, the push and the pull, are the strongest, and the habits and anxiety maybe the weakest. Because what you really want to do is start a new technology somewhere where you will see an instant change, instant excitement, and people will be really excited about that. And start that off there. Find your champion and then several operators behind them to make sure that's sustainable. And then resource them with sufficient time and materials to train a majority in that area all together as a team, and then use that team to seed the next two teams, and then use those teams to seed the next two teams beyond that. And we've seen this technique used quite a lot, actually, for non-AI technologies in organizations. It's a much cheaper way than paying hundreds of thousands of X to consultancies to achieve transformation, but it does require really deep engagement, really good champions. So there's a lot of energy you need to put at the top end, but this is a way to propagate. And you often see this with like EHR, super users, floor walkers. There's lots of models for this. This is a non-obvious one. Measure what you already measure. So I mean, as a company, we've been running the largest trial of ambient in Europe, right, with human observers. And it's incredibly expensive. It's really hard to maintain. The quality of the data you get really depends on how well you train your human observers to do it. So everyone thinks that if you want to try new technology or you want to try something, the best thing to do is just have people watch, do a proper study, apply all the pharma elements to it. But actually, in our experience, it's not actually the best thing to do at all. It's not scalable. You can't do large amounts of data with it. Most systems now will have some data. Don't know how deep it is. It's very variable in our experience. So, for example, if you want to measure an A&E study, what do you measure already about patient flow in A&E? Have you got the check-in time for the patients? Have you got the time to ward, decision to admit? What have you got stored somewhere that you can then compare if that's what you're trying to compare? And every way you can, try to use what you already have. If you're already somehow measuring the quality of the notes, or you're already measuring time to discharge, don't change your metrics, but make sure that whatever you're implementing has a meaningful change that you can measure. If you really get stuck, try and use humans sparingly. But if you want to do something at scale and demonstrate things that are robust, you really want to have a lot of throughput, like 5, 10, 20,000 patients. Very hard to do that reliably and sustainably with human beings. This is my favorite one. This is super unobvious. So everybody is different. I mean, that's not an unobvious thing to say, but what I mean is, for technology, you can't expect to win everybody's heart, but B, customization is also really important, and that actually is a really potentially thing you can do with AI technology, but also a really key part of AI technology, in that it can be many things to many people, unlike lots of previous software systems or digital health systems which were very fixed. AI, especially large language models, probabilistic, can be very customizable, and that's a big part of the journey. If your users that you're trying to get to adopt a technology inside your organization can make it feel like their own, that's when you've already won half the adoption. Like Epic, you can do a lot of customization for. People can already make their templates and lots of EHRs. Like, this is stuff that we recognize. But again, asking vendors and thinking, okay, how does the user make this their own? What's the user journey? And some of that delight, some of the elements is really important for stickiness. Again, prettiness and stickiness can be apart, but actually they're often together. If it's an enjoyable thing to use, people will use it, because we don't make rational decisions even in healthcare. And then that's how you calculate that for your ROI. So don't expect to win everybody. I think the best examples that we've seen thus far of like system-wide adoption of older technologies like voice recognition rarely gets above 30% if that's a really good technology. If it's something that's mandatory, EHRs is a good example of that, but then you're not leaving people with a choice. So like, are they using it to the fullest? Probably not. Are they optimizing it for the data model that you wanted to create? Probably not. And this is something that's really useful, and something that I've tried to apply to most of what we do here at Tortus, and actually lots of things. So I'm a company called Superhuman. They make an email app, which is a weird thing to try to make because there's so many incumbents. So they try to create a framework to understand how to improve their product based on a very, very simple question. And in product management, we use a term called product market fit, which basically means you've built something that people want in the simplest way. But how do you work that out? That's really hard. If you find one evangelist that loves it, is that enough? Do you need everybody to love it? Is that enough? And how do you know how to make it better to get to that maximum state? So in this framework, you literally just ask one question. How disappointed would you be if we took the thing away tomorrow? And they only know how to say, I'm going to be very disappointed, somewhat disappointed, or not at all disappointed. And the genius, I think, for me, is what you do with the response. So the users in your very disappointed box, if they say, oh, I love it because it's so fast, then you say, I'm going to make it faster. Or they say, I love it because it's so accurate, and you try and make it more accurate, or you make that accuracy more visible to them. The people in the somewhat group take their feedback with a little bit of pinch of salt. If it's easy to do, or you can do it, or you can change something meaningfully, then that might move them up to very. That's what you should do. But if it's very hard to do, it's very off-piece, and you can ignore it. And the genius other point here is that what you do with the people who say, I'm not at all disappointed, I don't like this thing at all, just ignore their feedback, because there's nothing that you can do that will ever win them into that daily users implementation. And actually focusing on a core segment that use it all the time is way more valuable than creating something which like hardly anyone uses or really likes to use, at least to its full extent. And then you kind of want to get to above 40% saying they're very disappointed, and then you know that you've got a great product that people are actually going to use. And then lastly, it's just a journey. And as I said to you at the beginning, once you change a workflow, then you have a new problem. Then you have to start from scratch. What is the problem? What am I trying to solve? What do I need to iterate? And again, just having that system to constantly monitor, to adjust and maintain is actually, unfortunately, baked into implementation. Okay, great. So we are going to go through some of these questions, and then we'll come to some of the questions in the chat. So if you remember, I often, let's submit this poll. Yeah, nice. So in tech, a product is defined as something you can buy in a shop, a process of converting an input to an output, or a mathematical equation. And remember, this is in tech. So I'll let some people answer it. I've got a decent amount of people on the call, about 20. Have some of my lunchtime coffee. Yeah, very good. So a process of converting an input to output. This is not an official definition, by the way. This is just my definition, but it's an easy one to think about when we think about this. Hold on, how do I get rid of this? Don't submit. Oh yeah, nice. Okay, so very good. The 4 forces of change are defined as push, pull, habits, and anxiety. Earth, wind, water, fire. Money, 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 money. And that's kind of a joke, and it's not really a joke, because obviously money is extremely important. Yeah, again, great. Most people are going for push, pull, habits, and anxieties. And I think, if nothing else, this is probably one of the most useful ways of thinking about whatever technology, making sure that you filled in all those boxes, so you've really thought about why people would want to change and how you do that. Okay, I'm going to vote for money, 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 because that's also important. Very good. And then last, but by no means least, and this should be very easy because we've literally just talked about it, the superhuman product market fit framework asks users one question. If the thing broke tomorrow, would you fix it? If the thing could be anything, what should it be? Or if we took the thing away tomorrow, how disappointed would you be? Which I appreciate is a bit of a double negative, but it's really important because it's one of those things that human beings think a lot more about loss aversion than they do about getting something new. So actually, it's a good way to phrase it because it makes you focus and you get more reliable answers as a consequence. Yeah, and then obviously people go, I think. Very good. Okay, well, just vote for whatever. That's it from me. We'll do some Q&A. Just a reminder, we've got one more session coming up in 2 weeks. This session will be recorded and published, and you can access it on the AI Training Academy wiki, which I will put in the chat and send out shortly. And you can also just get in touch with me at dom@tortus.ai if you have any other questions. 2 weeks time, We're going to talk about the future of AI in the NHS and just ask anything you want about AI to a bunch of clinical experts. So let's have a look at some questions. We've got a few different ones. Let's go through chat first. Nice visualization. Wasim Ahmed asked, does Tortus recognize other languages or vernacular speech? Yes and no. Yes, in that it does recognize. No, as it will do anything with that deliberately, because we haven't built clinical evaluation systems in things that aren't in English as yet. And therefore, we're wondering about whether there's an emergency use only kind of button, but we haven't quite figured that out yet. But I mean, for now, it's English only until we can do it safely. The models themselves capable in hundreds of languages, but we don't know what their accuracy is, and that's why that's a no for now. Tim Hunter says, I wonder about the change in clinical practice. Templates form part of patient safety. How we add patient safety frameworks to ambient with our visual templates. Again, it's interesting. You've changed the workflow. You've taken away a template that they were filling in. So now you have a new problem to solve. And I think with something, again, we've been asked about, maybe we just show the templates back to the user as a basic way of doing that to reinforce that safety. And maybe go one step further, add some real time where it can check through that you've done parts of the template. So we can probably do a bit of sort of real time work together. Some more questions, and keep asking your questions. So let's have a look at this one. What do you think are the biggest hurdles utilizing AI in primary care? That's actually a really good question. I think there's a few things. I think we've gone through a phase of early adopters. So when anyone has any new technology, there's a curve. The people that start using it are mad, and that anyone starting a new technology is always mad. They are a certain subset of users that are really techie, really understanding, always want to use the cutting edge, right? Then you have a gap, and that gap is often quite hard to get into the mainstream. And then you have the mainstream users who understand the technology and are happy to use it. I think one of the things right now is that a lot of the early adopters, that's a saturated market, but their needs, which are quite techy and really customizable and like doing a whole bunch of stuff, are actually quite different to mainstream. So now we're moving towards widespread and scale use. Those in primary care actually want a different experience. They want it to be simpler, more straightforward. They want to have trust. So I think there's a user adoption, and obviously there's a money adoption. In primary care, specifically in the UK, as we all know, there's a real squeeze on cash. Procurement rules are pretty tricky, but also some of the governance around this stuff, especially in primary care, where it's left up to each individual practice sometimes to do a lot of the paperwork without much support, that's really hard. And that creates a lot of friction. So I guess one of my things that I maybe missed out in the push and the pulls and the habits and anxieties is like, well, how do you actually access the technology in the first place? What's the paperwork? What's the friction to do that? I think that's actually probably one of the biggest hurdles, procurement and the IG side, the trust that somebody's done it, you don't have to do it yourself. If you could solve that, you could actually get adoption much, much, much more at scale. Ian Robinson has asked, can you please summarize the best available evidence for the use of AI scribes in a healthcare setting? Yeah, I mean, without having to, quote papers, it's a really tough question. I think there's been a few papers that have been published in reasonably good journals. Nejm published a study of DAX, but that was from 2 years ago. So that's Microsoft's products, about 2022. There was a study from Nabla, Kaiser a couple of years ago, and there's been a couple others with sort of nameless, vendors. We've published some of our own stuff. There's a published paper in the JMAR from last year, which is an early iteration of Tortus. I think there's a few threads that come through every single paper. One of the ones that's most obvious and almost undeniable now is cognitive load. There's lots of different ways to measure that, but essentially it means how hard or frustrating did you find the task with and without technology. We use something called the NASA Task Load Index, but there's variations of that. That was invented by NASA to figure out how hard tasks are to think about for astronauts. I was going to say spacemen, astronauts. And we see reductions of like 60%. And that's mostly because you're only doing one task instead of trying to do 2 or 3. That's pretty universal. I think time saving is quite difficult. We have observed that if you don't actually meet the user, to go to my point about the workflow, if you don't meet them where they are and it minimizes their edits for their workflow and what they need, you don't really save a lot of time at all. It has to be that sort of experience where it comes out exactly as you want it with no edits to really save the maximum time. We've seen, and many people have seen, some total time saving. We've definitely seen increases in direct care, so more time spent with patients. I mean, that's an obvious one. Quality of documentation, it's very hard to measure. So lots of people try to measure it in different ways, successfully and unsuccessfully. The Kaiser paper from a couple of years ago kind of looked at a subjective analysis of like, this is pretty good, but it was just sort of a, a sort of visual analog scale of doctors saying 1 to 10, this is good or bad, not super reproducible. We've tried a bunch of stuff. We use the SAIL score, which is the Sheffield Assessment of Inpatient Letters, and PDQ-9 you could potentially use, but it's not really fair. So quality is actually quite hard to measure. Some of the things I'd like to measure that no one's measured, and there's no published data, is like interrupting with your decision making, your cognitive flows, simulations. These are stuff that we kind of need to dig, but it is kind of not a great space actually for evidence, and we're trying to sort of correct that with some studies at the moment. And obviously the study that we're running, we should be publishing in a couple of months' time, so that hopefully will set the bar. Okay, no more questions on the questions side. Any other questions from anybody else? Pause there to have some coffee. Stephen's typing, so we shall wait with bated breath. Oh, he said no. Thanks, Stephen. That wasn't that helpful. Oh, someone's got a question. It's very good. Which trusts are using Tortus now? That's a bit. I don't think I'm allowed to say that on a public thing, but email me and I can tell you. I have to go talk to their comms teams. But we're live in quite a few, well, a couple of hospitals. Got some stuff in Southwest, got some primary care stuff as well. Oh no, my internet connection. No, just cut out there. So hopefully you heard that answer, but yeah, if you just drop me an email on that one. And am I rewired? Yes, apparently I'm speaking there. I don't know what I'm talking about yet. I shouldn't admit to that, should I? But it will be very exciting. So I will see you all there. A reminder again then, in 2 weeks' time, we have the future of AI in the NHS. Has got one more question. As a GP who is interested in introducing AI to my practice, help develop and interested in research, keen to educate myself more, where would you advise starting? Start right here, my friend. So there's a bunch of other AI related topics in this series, exactly pitched towards you as an audience, as somebody who wants to sort of practice. We personally have a bunch of e-learning stuff specifically for Tortus as a product, and there's lots of resources. I would always say people who really want to get into this stuff, there's some really good courses on Coursera by Andrew Ng, who's very simple to use. Some of it's some coding, but it just gets into the basic principles of a lot of this stuff. And then playing with it. I think playing with it, thinking about what other, research topics or tools could be produced with this technology. You'll see a lot of crazy developments all over the shop, but I think paying attention to some of the basics is probably the best place to start. Oh, some more questions. Great. Will AI products support the development or deployment of PAs? Presumably, you mean physician associates. I don't see why not. Most of these tools are pretty ubiquitous. Clinicians in general tend to do the same workflow. Need to find out about something about the patient, need to take history and exam, diagnose, need to, commit some decision making. I do think it's a very interesting one when you get into guidelines, into algorithmic care, in terms of who benefits most from sort of suggestions or cognitive. Lots of the clinical evidence suggests that actually senior physicians sometimes reject AI, but certainly don't benefit as much, whereas junior training physicians do benefit a lot more. So whether that also translates into physician associates and with a degree of oversight and autonomy, I don't know. So that was something to be very interested in. And there's been some AI products in the past that looked at sort of, the term is practicing at the top of your license. Don't know about that, and I'm probably not going to wedge into that right now, But I think there is an element to say, if we have a lot of knowledge around and we can distribute expertise, augmenting the full range of staff is probably a very good idea. And seeing what we can do with that as a technology, I wouldn't be surprised if that becomes the norm for sure. Loads of people are questions now. Okay, so Christo said, are there good cases, examples of people in this position porting their ambient AI across trusts? Not sure I understand that question. As in people taking it within their trust to lots of different places, or like between trusts, or scaling out. I'm not sure I understand that one, so I'm just going to leave that one off. How are you overcoming the challenge of selling Tortus into the NHS? Oh God, political ones. With great grace. No, I mean, it's difficult, right? It's a difficult macro environment. We've done pretty well in terms of being on the right procurement frameworks, of like doing all the clinical evidence and like selecting all the security elements to that. I think building evidence is really important. I think we're not very good at that as a nation, of building really high quality evidence for technology. That's been super helpful. Having all the badges and having a really strict way of managing data, really helpful to get into the right doors. I do think that there is a lot of difficulty right now. There's a lot of uncertainty. Is there money coming? Is there not? Where is it happening? That's a bit of a frustration. But we are seeing that this is technology that people want. That always helps. And certainly, working with clinical champions of generally like across the board, to be honest, also very helps. I think things will change. I'm hoping that there'll be more ability to easily port governance, for example, easily port procurement, and that will mean that when we've gone down the road a long way with one trust, we can take some of that at least to the next one, and it becomes a bit more repeatable. But yeah, it's certainly an ongoing fun challenge. Does Tortus support ordering blood metal scans in EHRs? Not yet. So we're a class 1 medical device, moving towards class 2. And when you get into ordering and prescriptions, it's pretty hard to argue that isn't a medical device. So the bar for clinical evaluation, for clinical evidence, for accuracy, very, very high. Even if you're just drafting it, giving it to the clinician. And there's a lot of complexity around the data models of different EHRs, how you can serve that to clinicians so they can approve. So for example, in Epic, there's only a few Epic sites in the UK, but they do have the ability to order and store it as a draft, which means the clinician can then take over and approve. And there's an easy way to hand off between the AI suggestion and what the clinician wanted to do that's safe and auditable. That's actually the main blocker. The technical capability to do this is not actually that hard, but it's the ability of handing back the clinical safety element, I think, which is much more important. So it will come, but it will take a little bit longer. What is the USP of Tortus versus other AI scribes such as Heidi, Corti? Yeah, I've got a little spiel now. So simplicity. So we've deliberately gone for a simple workflow, very simple user interface. You can't do as much with our tools as you can with some of our other competitors. Two reasons for that. One is we think that the mainstream requirements are actually simplicity is more important. But two, as a medical device, we have to be really constrained about what we are allowing to use, because everything has to be evidenced and documented, and that's really careful. So the second thing is about safety. Only class 1 medical device in our category, moving towards class 2, but also a bunch of clinical evidence and clinical evaluation on the back. And last, sovereignty. We're the only British company doing this at the moment. NHS born and raised. I trained down the road at UCH many years ago, and I think that does count, because we are building specific things for the NHS coding systems, NHS specific notation systems, and constantly thinking about what can we build specifically for our system to help our system do better. And I think that's a really important part of the product and our DNA. Stephen says, God, loads of questions. Do you need more clinicians interested in AI working with you? Jobs on offer. Watch this space, Stephen. Always interested in people who are interested. But I think there is an element as well around implementation and creating champion teams and things. And that's something that we're probably looking at to do more as we start scaling up. Adele says there are about 60 AI medical scribes on the market. They won't all survive. What's the future? Where are they heading with their abilities? Super good question. In the UK, there's not that many. So I think there's about 90 globally, but 70 of them all in the US right now. They won't all survive, and they won't all survive because this is going to become a regulated space. I don't see a world where it can't in terms of the safety of what you can do, especially as you expand the capabilities. When you start making suggestions or doing orders or doing diagnosis or anything useful, additional to Scribe, that becomes a medical device, a regulated environment. So that will compress. So the really good example of this is when I heard the story recently, so don't quote me, this is true. Combustion engine was invented. Within 2 or 3 years of that invention, there was like 400 car companies, but within 10 years of that invention, there was like 6. So what happened to the 394? Well, the cars blew up on the road. And I think this is a similar thing. As we see adoption, safety, evaluation, medical device regulation will oversee and actually kick out a lot of the poorly thought out players in the market. And the ones that will survive will be the ones that can basically operate in healthcare, as opposed to any other industry where the stakes are much higher and the requirements are much more severe. Great. I think we got through all of them. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Christo asked about moving between trusts. Unfortunately, the answer to this one, Christo, is like if you're going to move between trusts and use AI technology, you can't take it with you unless the trust approves this. And we've seen this, and I can tell you firsthand when we found other, won't say who, companies being used in trusts where they weren't approved, those clinicians came to some significant disciplinary difficulty. What's the phrase? Meeting with no coffee, I think is the words that were used. And that's because essentially what you're doing is you're taking patient data and you're storing it somewhere where the trust hasn't overseen. Now, most of these technologies have been through these approval processes. So there is an element of that, but it's probably just not worth your personal risk. So I would always say, go to the trust, say, I want to use this tool. What do you think about it? I'll give you a definitive answer. But it actually has kickstarted conversations and then people get to use it. And that's actually a great way to become a champion for something that you think is useful when you want to change in your department. Very good. Chats wise, Adele said one recent paper evaluating ambient listening showed no overall increase in efficiency in doctors, but there were differences between types of clinician specialty focused. Have you noticed this at all, and what types is it best worst suited for? Super good question. The paper that you're referring to is from a competitor. I won't say who, but it's 2 years old, so it predates a lot of the systems now. And as I said to you before, customization is a big part of the time saving. I know from a fact that a lot of the early pilots of this technology failed because they would just produce outputs which weren't close enough to the physician to actually be able to use. We saw that with our early iterations, and most other ambient companies did. Now the technology is much more mature, it's much more capable, and being able to be, latency as well as massively reduced. So I'd say most of the papers in this space go out of date as soon as they're published, really, which makes it quite difficult to follow. In terms of different types of clinician specialty focus, not particularly. There's a really good case for GP land, but it's more dependent on the clinician actually than it is, in my experience, in the specialty itself. Because as we know, we all practice quite differently, even in the same department. I think where we've seen some real winners, primary care, I think potentially a real winner developing in the A&E department for obvious reasons, and new patients in outpatients, but not follow-up, interestingly. So that's another change. Okay, well, we're at time and we're over time. Thank you so much again. See you all in 2 weeks' time for a fun session of looking into the future. And we'll take that very much.